Shalom, friends. It's wonderful to be together again, especially in large numbers. We have 92 already on this webinar, and others will be joining. And you should know, I've received a number of communications of people who regretted not being able to be with us, but wanting to make sure that we are recording it and that the recording will be available. Clearly, both the topic and our speakers generate tremendous interest. So this is another in a series of webinars that we are holding, co-sponsored by Hiddush, the Israel Diaspora Partnership for Religious Freedom and Equality, with HUC-JIR, Rabbis and Cantors for Religious Freedom and Equality, J-Plan, the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network, and the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists. And we are alternating, as many of you have been on our webinars know, between topics that have rabbinic contents, interest, and those that have a greater focus on legal issues. We are honored to have a number of participants in this webinar who represent and lead our sponsors, and we have already 100 participants, so I can't really see all the names, but I see Judge Peter Buxbaum, the co-chair of J-Plan, the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network, and Rabbis Rachel Yurovitz and Rabbi Neil Gold, and possibly others who are on the board on the executive committee of HUC-JIR, and I apologize if I don't see you all. I know that Steve Greenwald, the president of the AAL-JL, sent his apologies. He couldn't be with us, but I'm sure there are members of the Jewish Pluralism.
I'm actually here, Uri.
Oh, you are? Wonderful. Okay.
I can't do the one on the 8th of December. That's what I said.
Good, good, good. And I know that a very important colleague with an interesting record is supposed to be with us today as well, Rabbi Capers Fania of Chicago, and I hope that he's on this call. His interest in the development of Judaism and Jewish expressions in Israel is obvious, and I hope we'll be able to have him as a participant in one of our future webinars as well. So our topic is Reform and Masorti Judaism in Israel and their growing indigenous character. I still remember the years, and Rabbi Paul Yedwab reminded us that we go back many years. So going back many years, it was clear that Reform and Conservative Judaism labeled as implants, as American, transplant to Israel, which I was told repeatedly have no chance of growing, no chance of succeeding. And of course, the reality on the ground has proven differently, to the point that our participants today, our speakers on the panel, Rabbi Gilad Kariv, Rabbi Chaya, Rowen-Baker, and Professor Rabbi Dalia Marx, represent this indigenous growth and will speak on two aspects of this growth and the uniqueness of these movements in Israel, namely the organizational, congregational setting in the Reform movement, and maybe Rabbi Gilad Kariv will mention something about the sort of counter sentiment to stressing the indigenous nature of the movement by moving away from the title of the movement, Yahadut Mitkademet, Progressive Judaism, and actually embracing the Reform title, even in Hebrew, which is no indication of Americanization of the movement, but is an interesting side issue as well. So Rabbi Gilad Kariv is the head of the Israeli Reform Movement, a long-time leader, member in numerous bodies and most sort of relevant in recent developments in the Jewish world. He is leading the reform team on the Israeli side in the World Zionist Organization, and is, like myself, also an attorney and a longtime colleague and friend. Rabbi Chaya Rowen-Baker is the rabbi of Ramot-Zion congregation in French Hill in Jerusalem, sort of the mothership of the Masorti movement in Israel. And we didn't discuss it, but it's very challenging to be the rabbi of Ramot-Zion congregation in Jerusalem, because that congregation, I think, has almost as many rabbis, members of the congregation, as it has members. And as every rabbi knows, that certainly is keeping you on your toes on a daily basis. And Chaya, in her background, has also led the young adults and student movement, Mahom, of the Masorti movement in Israel, and certainly is qualified to share with us both the congregational setting and the outreach to young adults and to students. And as you know, Professor Dalia Marx, Rabbi Professor Dalia Marx, is the Rabbi Aaron Penkin Professor of Liturgy and Midrash at Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem. And as I indicated in the previous webinar, she sort of epitomizes the phenomenon of how accepted liberal Judaism, non-Orthodox Judaism, has become in Israel as reflected in the media, and is on radio, television, on a weekly and sometimes a number of times every week in Israel.
Don't exaggerate, Uri. Don't exaggerate.
Well, that's how it seems to me. Somehow every time I turn on the radio, I hear Rabbi Dalia Marx interviewed. One additional word about the topic, and then obviously you are here to listen to our panelists and not to me. And that is that going back to the 70s, when that phrase, this misguided phrase was coined, the synagogue, the average Israeli Jew doesn't set foot in, has to be Orthodox. That was tossed at us repeatedly and was taken to represent the reality. The reality has never been that, but if empirical evidence was necessary, then Hiddushes and other surveys indicate that at this point, somewhere between 11 to 13% of the adult Jewish population in Israel responds to the question, how do you affiliate yourself in terms of belonging, affiliating with, aligning with the different streams in Judaism? 11 to 13% say Reform or conservative. This is a long way from the time that the claim was the synagogue the Israeli doesn't set foot in has to be Orthodox. So to explain to us how that happened, where are we going, and what are the characteristics of the movements in terms of their indigenous Israeli character, we have the best possible people, and we'll start with Rabbi Gilad Kariv. Gilad, the webinar is yours.
Shalom to all the veteran friends and the new friends that I'm meeting here in this webinar for the first time. Many familiar faces I can identify on the screen, and many new faces. It's a pleasure and honor to be here with you. Uri, please guide me how long I'm allowed to share my thoughts.
Well, what we suggested was that we'll start with a 10 to 12 minute introduction, then we'll have a second round, and then we'll respond. And this is a good reminder, if you want to raise questions to the speakers, please write them in the chat. And even if we are not able to answer all of them, we'll try to ask our speakers afterwards to respond them, and we'll send you additional responses.
So Uri just presented me as a friend and as a colleague, and it is true that we are good friends, but instead of suggesting that I'm his colleague, I will suggest that I'm Uri's follower and disciple, and this is a good opportunity to start this webinar by acknowledging Uri's pioneering contribution to the process that we are trying to analyze together in this webinar. He definitely belongs to a generation of Sabras, of indigenous Israelis that identified, in his case, in our case, the reform movement as a matured expression of our Israeli Zionist Jewish identity, and in his public advocacy work and in his legal work, definitely created many of the opportunities that my generation of rabbis and leaders in the movement and the younger generations used and succeeded to exploit. I would like to suggest or to open my thoughts by challenging the topic of our discussion. Uri used the Lashon Nekiya, used the PC words to phrase the question, but actually the issue of how indigenous the non-Orthodox movements, the Israeli non-Orthodox movements are a way to ask the question, isn't it all about a group of North American and European Olim that came to Israel and failed to leave behind them those pieces of their diaspora Jewish tradition who is less relevant to the Israeli reality? And now I'm allowing myself to present the question in an Israeli manner, in a Dugri manner, because we all know that this question plays a very important role in the attempt to suggest that the egalitarian streams of Judaism do not have an indigenous, authentic role to play in Israel. And in that regard, although I'm going to address the question, I would like also to suggest that maybe we need sometimes to push back when this question is being presented to all of us here in Israel and in the overseas communities. And many times when I'm meeting young Israelis and when I'm presenting to them our movement and its ideology, I'm reminding them that Ben-Gurion had a very heavy Polish accent, and that Golda Meir had a very heavy American accent. And I'm doing that in order to remind them that by definition, the state of Israel was built by great pioneers, great Zionists, great Jews and great Israelis, all of them carrying foreign accents from East and West. And in that regard, the fact that our two movements were established first by great Zionists with heavy German accent, and then great Zionists with heavy American accent. This is part of the story of Zionism and the state of Israel, and in that regard, there is no difference between our movements and our communities and any other ideological and religious and political player in Israel. And I would like to suggest that instead of asking the question of what exactly is the accent you hear when you enter a Reform congregation today in Israel, we will identify that the two important elements are different. They are in a way related to the question that was presented, but we need to use those factors and not the more common question about the English accent in Kol HaNeshama or in any other progressive, small p progressive community in Israel. One question that we need to deal with is, do we succeed to serve a diverse Israeli crowd? How diverse is our target audience? And how diverse are the crowds that we do succeed to inspire and to serve in our congregations together with our rabbis and through our other institutions in Israel? Because in the end, regardless to the question, are we mainly serving sabras or newcomers, a movement that wants to be an influential player, a movement that wants to be well-rooted in the Israeli society must be or develop itself to be a diverse movement in the crowds that are included in our operation. And the second question is the question of, is your operation a multi-generational operation? That because one can suggest that, like in many other cases, when people immigrate to a foreign country, in the first generation and sometimes in the second generation, there is a tendency to hold some elements of the cultural, linguistic, political affiliations that we had in the old country. My grandparents that came to Israel before the Second World War, for years were active in this group, this organization of the Olim from a specific part of Poland. I'm, as their grandchild, has nothing to do with this organization. So a movement that wants to be an influential movement cannot be an organization of one or two generations. And the questions of a multi-generational operation is a very relevant question. And here we need to identify the fact that the attempt to talk about the American or the European origin of the Reform and Conservative movement and the way that it is done in Israel is only an attempt to strengthen the delegitimization of those two movements. And as I will share with you, those efforts, largely speaking, are failing. Now, not only because I learned a lot from Uri, also because I strongly believe that we are today in a point that allows us to check the things and to base our analysis on a clear data. I believe that the answer to the questions that Uri presented and to the two factors I suggested as the important factors can be found in numbers and should be looked for in different studies and different surveys. The numbers do not tell us everything, but they offer us a solid base to have a true discussion and to separate news from fake news and to identify the fact that people are using false information in order to promote their political causes, to block the growth of the two movements. And in that regard, I do want to share with you, and I understand, Uri, I can share the document, right? For Uri, right? I can share a document. No, I need you to allow me to share it. Okay. No, I can't do it yet. I need you to allow me to share the document, but
Or you need to make him co-host.
yes, you need to become a. I'm still not able to do that. In a minute, Uri will allow me, and I will use the time. Okay, now I can do it.
Yes.
Wonderful. So.
In the meantime, Rabbi Michael Chernik is asking, we are speaking about reform and conservative, Rabbi Michael Chernik is asking, what about the Beit Tfilah Israeli phenomenon and a few communities like?
You will see that I will address it in few words, but I do want to share with you four figures. We don't have the time to go into each figure in depth, but I think that you'll get the general concept. And I took a decision not to take the figures out of their original presentation, because after I will finish my presentation, I will put in the chat the link to the entire study that was published not by us, but rather by the Jewish Peoplehood Policy Institute of the Jewish Agency. And I want to share with you four figures. The first echoes what Uri already presented to you, that in a long list of studies and surveys, most of them were not conducted by the movements or by organizations that are in a way identified with the non-Orthodox streams. We can see that a significant group of Israelis identify itself with reform or conservative movements. And it's important to say that those questions are presented in a very clear way. The question is not about how many Israelis support the two movements or their claim for equality. It is a question about the way people identify themselves. And in most of those surveys, a majority of Israelis, around 52, 53%, tend to say, I don't identify myself with any religious stream. Most of them are, of course, secular Israelis. And we see that in most of the surveys, between 11 to 13% of all Israeli Jews say we identify ourselves, religiously speaking, with reform or conservative Judaism. Many of them at the same time will identify themselves as secular or as light traditional. It might be seen as a contradiction in North American eyes or in European eyes. Here in the Israeli reality, there is no contradiction in a person's statement, I'm a secular Jew, and when it comes to my religious practices or traditional practices, I identify myself with reform or conservative Judaism. Only one study, the Israeli Pew, that was conducted in the end by a right-wing Orthodox institution, shows different figures, and the left side red line represent the outcomes from the survey in 2012. They were released in 2013, and it can tell you something also about the growth the two movements experienced in the last 8 to 10 years. The second figure I asked to share with you, in a way, proves or strengthens what we just saw in the first figure. And here the question, in a specific survey not conducted by us, but rather by the JPPI, was about the synagogue Israelis attended in the year that the survey was conducted. It was conducted 2 years ago. And 32% of the Israeli Jews said, I didn't visit a synagogue in the last 12 months. Not surprisingly, 52% said we visited an Orthodox synagogue. But please look at the green and gray parts of the circle. 22% of the Israeli Jews said that in this specific year, they visited a non-Orthodox egalitarian synagogue. I'm putting aside the egalitarian Orthodox synagogue. There is a question how people or what people truly refer to when they say secular Judaism and synagogue, but putting aside those definitions, almost a quarter of all the Israeli Jews said 2 years ago that they visited a non-Orthodox egalitarian synagogue during this specific year. The two last figures I want to share with you.
Maybe skip the next slides and just try to come to the conclusion of this part.
I'm coming to the conclusion, and instead of sharing with you some thoughts, I think that the numbers are the important thing to answer the question you presented, Uri. So I will not go in depth those figures, but you'll understand them immediately. The question of how indigenous our movement is clearly presented in this diagram. And here you can see that it is clear that the claim that the non-Orthodox movement belong only or serve only Western Jews, Ashkenazic Jews, and there is no presence to Mizrahi Jews or to Sabra Jews in our operation is a false claim. And actually, the percentage of Mizrahi Jews that identify themselves with Reform and Conservative Judaism is similar to the percentage, the general percentage of Mizrahi Jews in the entire Israeli society. And the last diagram also echoes this message from another angle when you identify the political affiliation of our crowds. And it's a known claim that the Reform movement, especially the Reform movement, is a movement of lefties. But in the end, when you check the numbers, you see that 39%, almost 40% of the people that identify themselves in the different studies as Reform Israeli Jews declare themselves to be a right-wing when it comes to Israeli politics. And I will share with you thoughts about what we need to do with it in the second round, but one thing is clear. The numbers of all recent studies and surveys done in Israel, mainly not by us, but by other think tanks, suggest that the conservative movement in Israel and the Reform movement in Israel succeeded in the last 2 decades to address a very diverse audience, and that this audience is definitely not leaning only on newcomers or veteran comers from North America and from. In the second round, I will continue to share my thoughts about those numbers.
Thank you, Rabbi Kariv and Rabbi Chaya Rowen-Baker. The floor and the webinar is yours. What would you like to share with us about the rise and growth of Masorti Judaism in Israel?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This is a special forum for me because I feel like I'm among friends, but most of the faces are not familiar. But hello to all of you, nonetheless. Gilad gave such a wonderful basis of information, which is really very, very important that we, it's very important that we base what our thoughts and our insights on numbers. But I'd like to try to complement that picture with things that are less measurable, things that are more a question of experience, of the way I experience these issues. First of all, I want to pick up on something which I think is crucial that Gilad mentioned, which is that the attempt to delegitimize the Masorti and reform movements is the way Gilad framed it makes it so clear that it's really an attempt not to delegitimize the fact that it's important, not to criticize the fact that it's important, but to criticize the values on which they are based. Because, as Gilad pointed out, everything in Israel is imported by definition. And so when you say the attempt to delegitimize us is the attempt to delegitimize our values, and I ask, what does it mean to be Israeli? What does it mean to be an Israeli movement or an Israeli religious phenomenon? What if you want to be an Israeli movement, if you want to be an Israeli presence, you have to speak the language of the Israeli culture. Now, what is the language of the Israeli culture? If someone is going to say to me the language of the Israeli culture is the language which is being used, is the language of misogynism and of xenophobia and of racism, which we find in the streets of Israel, then I think that the first thing we need to do before we even talk about numbers or cultural mafionim, cultural characteristics, is to first of all say, what is Israeli? Israeli is being formed. Israelism is being formed. It's been formed over the past 72 years, and it's still being formed. And part of being Israeli is to be a part of forming that, and not to say we align with one cultural language or another, which may or may not be the language of the area in which we are, or the language of the groups in which we are surrounded, but we are Israeli in that we are here together building Israeli culture, building a culture of a language of tolerance and of egalitarianism and of human rights and of love between people and appreciation between people and respect between people, and respect not only between people, respect to the world and in which we live. And I think I really feel very strongly that the claim towards one person or another, you are or you aren't Israeli. I mean, this is what we've been dealing with for 7 years. How who is more indigenous? Who is more of a native? No one is indigenous. Everyone is coming together, trying to form together a proper Israeli culture, and that's being Israeli. That's being Israeli is doing that, is carrying that together. And for the past 40 plus years, the Reform and the conservative movements have been doing just that, have been engaging with, as Gilad said so eloquently, engaging with a variety of groups, a variety of age groups, of people from different backgrounds, and offering what we know how to offer. Sorry, and engaging people in reclaiming their Jewish identity, and in creating here a country that speaks Jewish, that speaks liberal Jewish, and that tries to live in that way. And I think I want to share a couple of thoughts of how I feel that this is not yet, of course, fully a success, but is on the path to being a success. One is, first of all, just the fact that in the studies that Gilad mentioned, and also you mentioned, Uri, even just asking the question, we have to pause for a second and recognize that even just asking the question. I remember as a child growing up in Ra'anana, I remember a specific phone call. I remember picking up the phone and hearing on the other end someone conducting one of these surveys, and they asked me, "Datiya or Chilonit?" And are you religious or are you secular? And I didn't know what to say. I called over my parents and I said, "What are we? Are we Datiim or Chilonim?" Because I mean, we're Datiim, but when I say Ani Datiya, I know that it doesn't mean the same thing to the person conducting survey as it means to me, and I'm giving them the wrong data, so to speak. But those aren't the questions anymore in these surveys, right? It was Dati Chiloni or Dati Chiloni Masorti, which doesn't mean Masorti the way I'm Masorti, right? We all know that, in a home traditional. And now the question is being asked differently. The question is being asked: are you conservative? Are you reform? Are you something else? And the idea of a diverse Jewish identity in Israel is becoming more and more rooted in all the circles which deal with Jewish identity. There is no mechina, or that's overstating. Many mechinot, okay, many pre-army programs are put on their curriculum, studying the streams, inviting people from our movements to come and speak and to explain what is the reform movement, what is the conservative movement. I know personally, I go to several of those every year. I teach courses in the mechinot. I know all my colleagues, and I'm sure my reform colleagues experience the same phenomenon. Many schools are asking us to come and speak and to hear what we have to say and to expose the students. That's not to say that there isn't antagonism, and that's not to say that there isn't pushback from the students, but it's on the agenda. It's on the agenda of educators, and it's on the agenda of any forum, any self-respecting forum which deals with Jewish identity and with questions of identity. The fact is that I think maybe even more than the Kehilot and the presence that we have in the synagogues and wherever the synagogues can reach, I feel the effects of liberal Jewish education seeping into government institutions, municipal institutions. Just the other day, someone called me. She introduced herself as someone working for the Iriya, for the Jerusalem municipality, and she said, "I'm working on we're working as a municipality. We're working on a strategic planning process, and for French Hill. And someone told me that I need to talk to you. So to try to understand what's happening in French Hill." So we started talking, and it turns out that she grew up in Noam, the conservative youth movement, and in our Kehillat in Ramot-Zion. But she didn't call me because she knew me because of Ramot-Zion. She called me because she works for the Iriya, and the Iriya said, "You need to call you need to, you need to work on French Hill, and one of the institutions you need to talk to is the conservative synagogue there, but here we see our people sort of, I don't know how she practices, and I don't know what she does today in her personal life, but the fact of the matter is she grew up knowing and understanding and internalizing the language of liberal Judaism. And now she's out there working for the Jerusalem municipality and conducting a strategic planning process in the municipality of Jerusalem. And people like that are all over the place. Our people, this is going to sound like a spy movement. We were infiltrating our people everywhere. That's how I feel. I feel like our people who grew up in our movements, in our youth movements, in our kehillot, who had bar and bar mitzvahs processes in our kehillot, grow up, and a certain percentage of them find jobs in public service, and that gives an exponential effect to our presence, because we have a positive ear in those places, and slowly this phenomenon is growing. Again, not only people within the kehillot, but people who go through our kehillot and find their way into all kinds of places in Israeli society, and are out there. People that we influenced, who are out there holding a liberal take on Judaism, and a positive take on their Jewish identity. I'm running out of time, so I just want to say I want to just share one last story with which is one of many, where I just feel like it's become more normal, more natural. I mean, people, okay, here's another half story before the actual story. Half story is that even I, in my 14 years in the rabbinate, and I guess something like 20 years before that of being an active conservative Jew, out in the streets protesting or explaining or whatever we did in Noam, my experience in my lifetime has changed. My experience used to be that I know that if I'm going to say to someone that I'm conservative, it's going to start a half-hour conversation, argument. First of all, what does it mean? Who are you? What is that? Is it reform? How is it different from reform? And then arguing with me about whatever it is I'm going to say. And I used to think very carefully before I said that I was conservative, before I said I belonged to the conservative youth movement or whatever it was. And even in the beginning, before I said I was a rabbi, if someone would ask me, what do you do? If a cab driver asked me, what do you do for work? Sometimes I would sort of say I teach Judaism, or something like that, because I knew that if I said I was a rabbi, then it would start this whole thing, and I didn't always have energy to start this whole thing. And more and more, when someone asks me, what do you do? And I say, Ani Rabbah, which in Hebrew, I guess would be the feminine form of Rav, then more and more the reaction is, oh, that's interesting. And that's the end of it. And they might think that I'm Reform. They probably do. But they've heard the term. They've come to terms with the term, and it's less of an issue to say, oh, here's a woman who's a rabbi. And my story is that there was this little hole in the wall laundromat in the neighboring neighborhood, Ramat-Zion, and I put my talit there to be dry cleaned, and a bunch of other things. And of course, I left them there for a long time, because that's just the way my family rolls. And then a few months later, I guess, my husband went to pick it up. My husband, who, I never knew that the laundromat guy knew to associate him with me. I never knew that he knew that I was a rabbi. Anyway, my husband goes to pick up the stuff, and he says, listen, I lost the little slip. Maybe you remember I left some stuff here a long time ago to be dry cleaned. And the guy says, oh yeah, the rabbi's talit, right? And I said, oh, so there you have it. The laundromat guy knows that I'm the rabbi and remembers my talit. And it's just like completely matter of fact that my very feminine looking talit is just the rabbi's talit. And so I feel like more and more of these kinds of things are happening around us. The numbers Gilad brought are the empirical data, if anyone needs that. But it's not just the data in wherever studies are being done. It's the actual feeling in the streets, in the cabs, in classrooms, dealing with government officials. Of course, there's so much more work to do, but I can definitely say that we feel a change in how how accepted and how legitimate this is becoming and thought of.
Thank you, Rabbi Chaya. You have certainly given us an added perspective, and the two of you have sort of painted a much more complete picture that goes beyond just the sum of the Reform perspective and the Masorti perspective. We turn now to Rabbi Dalia Marx, unfortunately with limited time, but Dalia can give us an added dimension, that which comes from the liturgy of the movements. Before you speak, to make things even more complicated, Rabbi Paul Yedwav has asked us about Rabbi Sivan Mas and secular Rabbanim and secular Judaism. So if you could relate to that aspect as well from your scholarly review of the map of Jewish pluralism in Israel. And in the meantime, Gilad and Chaya, if you could look at the notes and the questions, we'll only have a few minutes for you for a second round. Pick from the chat the questions that you think you would like to respond to at this time. Dalia.
Shalom, everyone. So good to be with you. I was born in Israel. I'm a 10th generation Jerusalemite, but I think when it comes to time managing, I'm trying to be with my father's side, who was a Yeke. So I'll try to meet the guidelines that we discussed here. My friend and colleague, and actually my rabbi, Chaya, Rebecca Rowan is my rabbi because I'm a congregant in her congregation, is often known to be too modest. So I'll tell you what's the story. Yeah, if you go in our neighborhood, the French Hill here in Jerusalem, and ask people on the street, who is the neighborhood's rabbi? There is a neighborhood rabbi. He gets funded by the government or the municipality. I don't know pretty well, but nobody knows him. Everybody will tell you it's Chaya Bekeron. Yeah, because she practically functions as the community leader, not just the community of Ramot-Zion, but the larger community of our neighborhood. What I would like to do is share with you a few thoughts about the liturgy, especially the new liturgy that it was composed in the Reform movement. But first of all, about the title, the De-Angloization, or whatever you pronounce it. I'm not sure I'm completely happy with the title. I think we often talk about the fact that this is the 3rd century of Reform Judaism. The 1st century was German, the 2nd century was North American, and now we claim to be an important center here in Israel. So it doesn't mean that we are decentralizing other centers, but we are building upon them. I think this is what we're trying to do. So when we talk about what does it mean to have a native or indigenous Reform liturgy, I think we talk about several things. So first of all, the fact that the liturgy is in Hebrew. This is not an obvious thing, that the holy language is also the language of the vernacular, the language in which we speak. So on one hand, it's much easier because a competent Hebrew reader can understand the liturgy. But on the other hand, it's more difficult because we cannot use friendly user, adequate translation to say what we want to say, yeah? Because I would say that most of the creativity in the diaspora reform liturgy is not in the Hebrew, but in most cases, but in the translation, in the English version. So that's one thing, the fact that we speak Hebrew and we operate in a much more, I would say, traditional setting, and that requires something of us because people do understand what they're saying. There's no way around it. Maybe that explains why a lot of people cannot find themselves coming to the synagogue. Chaya, you remember every year, not this year maybe, but every year on Yom Kippur, we see people circling around the synagogue and you see that they cannot bring themselves to enter the synagogue. This is a heartbreaking thing, but this is something that has to do with the Israeli society. It's not only the language, it's the religious coercions and other issues that I don't want to talk about right now. Another aspect is what I would call the voices of the liturgy. And here, let me just upload here a few examples from the new Israeli Reform Siddur that I was fortunate enough to be one of its co-editors with Rabbi Alona Lisitsa. And one of the things that we kept asking ourselves, and Gilad was also very active in the work of the Siddur, is what makes it an Israeli Reform Siddur? Yes, it was very important for us. You know what? Let me share with you just before that. This is the title of the Siddur, Tfilat Adam, and the subtitle is Siddur Reformi Israeli, which is a very different approach from the Masorti movement. This is a Siddur of the Masorti movement, and it just says Siddur Israeli. Yes, it's an Israeli Siddur. We wanted to emphasize the fact that this is an Israeli Reform Siddur, and the title of the Siddur, Tfilat Adam, is a hint to all who see it and all who listen to it, because it's as you know, it's the final words of Hannah Senesh's most famous poem, Halicha leKesaria, Eli, Eli, right? So I think it sort of transmits to people that there are many ways to worship God. There are many ways to be in a congregation. There are many ways to pray. There's not just one way of praying. And we did try to include as much as we can create Israeli and modern creativity within the Siddur. So here, for example, this is an additional part of the Friday night service, and we called it Lekabel et HaShabbat leorka ulerochba shel haaretz, accepting the Shabbat throughout the land. So we have a poem from Jezreel Valley, and from Bikat Ginosar, and from Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and the village, etc. That is to say, we wanted to include as much as we can Israeli experiences. So this is one thing. The second thing or third thing that I want to mention here is the great sensitivity that we try to have to the yearly cycle events of the Israeli society, what we sometimes refer to as the Israeli high holiday. So we have the Memorial Day for the Fallen Soldiers, and we have a reference to the Havdalah service between the Memorial Day and Yom Ha'atzmaut. But we also have some things that are mostly mentioned in Israel. Let me give you one example here, and this is the Memorial Day for the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. There is a special El Maleh Rachamim for him, and another prayer that we added here. So we try to make it as much as we can. How can I call it? An Israeli experience. We have quite a few texts that have to do with the IDF, people joining the IDF, or the special prayer for the soldier. This is not just in the Reform Siddur, of course, but we have our own text there. People who join the army. And we have texts for people who make Aliyah, for LGBTQ experiences, which is not typically Israeli. It's not typically an Israeli thing, but we created the Israeli, how can I say, context for that. The last thing that I would like to share with you, do I have 2 minutes more or not so much? Yes?
Well, do share one more.
All right, so I can conclude here. All right.
All right. Do you want to say anything about secular Judaism and?
No, I have much more to say about Reform Judaism, but time runs out, so I will pass. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I see that there is already an interest of people in getting the Siddur, so we'll write afterwards to all those who registered.
It is in the printing house as we speak. We hope to have it in our hands in a week or so, just so that you know.
Okay, so before we turn back to Rabbi Kariv and Rabbi Rowen-Baker, one thing is I clearly owe an apology. There were other people, possibly quite a number of people who wanted to join the webinar, but were blocked by Zoom. We are supposed to have a 500 participants cap, but for whatever reason, which I can't fix now, we are blocked at 100. So we'll apologize to those who registered and couldn't get in. Fortunately, we'll have a recording. Two, a reminder, in 2 weeks, again on a Tuesday, not a Monday, we will have another fascinating webinar, which I think will be of tremendous interest to people on the topic of Jewish law as a source for Israeli law, the challenge and the reality, namely a different angle of the digging into the question of what does it mean for Israel to be a Jewish and democratic state, and what's the role of Jewish law in all of that. Dr. Benjamin Porat of the Hebrew University and the Israel Democracy Institute will be lecturing on that. And we turn now to Gilad and to Chaya. And one of the questions that was asked is regarding the independent congregations. And as I mentioned, secular groups. And another is a question that is often asked, and you are familiar with it. Will the movements merge at some point going forward? Go ahead, Gilad. Gilad?
You're muted.
We don't hear you.
So Uri, thank you for presenting those two questions, and I will address them shortly, and I will also say something about what was already mentioned by you, the fact that we changed the official name of our movement a few years ago, and the name of the movement is התנועה הרפורמית יהדות מתקדמת בישראל, the Israeli Reform movement. I'll address first the issue of the unaffiliated congregations. We are very careful to impose our brand and our identity on others. In the role of each rabbi and each congregation to decide how they want to define themselves. And in that regard, we definitely embrace the fact that there are egalitarian, liberal, small p progressive congregations in Israel that are not affiliated either with the reform movement or with a conservative movement. I think that most people, when they enter those congregations, they will not identify a huge difference between the theology, the liturgy, and the ideology of those congregations and most of the reform or conservative congregations in Israel. And yet, we respect their decision not to be affiliated. Many of them are led by people that were trained in one of the non-Orthodox seminaries in Israel, either the HUC or the Schechter Institute. Some of them grew in our movements. And in that regard, the affiliation to a specific movement is less important. The more important question is, how do we succeed to duplicate the cases of success for egalitarian, inclusive, small p progressive Judaism in Israel? And for that regard, we strongly believe that you need movements, that the role of the movements in Israel is to set the infrastructure for closing this generational gap that exists today in Israel. We need to be honest that the two movements were late to invest in Medinat Israel and in Eretz Israel. And in that regard, the modern Orthodox community and the ultra-Orthodox community have advantage of almost 3 generations. And we need to close a serious gap in our human infrastructures, physical infrastructures, political and financial infrastructures. And in order to close this gap, you need to be a part of a movement, and I'm not hesitating to advocate for the need in central bodies. And again, I'm a chassid of numbers. When you check how many conservative and reform affiliated congregations were established in the last 10 years in Israel through the efforts of the central bodies of the movements, together with local groups of lay leaders and talented rabbi, you come to discover that when 3, 4, maybe 5 independent egalitarian congregations were established in the last 10 years in Israel, the two movements together established almost 50 new congregations and communal operations. And for me, that's the important point. There is a big difference between places like Bet Filah Israeli and Igun Alev, who are synagogue-based congregations, and the important work of humanistic, atheistic, secular Jewish organizations in Israel. Some of them are using the title of rabbis, and it's a legitimate choice. Some of them are refraining themselves from touching this title of rabbis, like Bina, but definitely there is a role to secular atheistic organizations and communities in Israel. Please keep in mind that, again, when you check the numbers, the vast majority of Jews in Israel are interested, even if they are secular Jews, to include in their family life and private life religious and traditional aspects of the Jewish culture and tradition. And in that regard, I think that most Israelis, including many Israelis, many secular Israelis, do want to have a synagogue in which they feel comfortable. My last comment is about the two movements. Again, I want to suggest that it is a less important question if the sociological, theological, political processes, both in Israel but also outside Israel, bring the two movements to a situation that there is a logic in building first joint institutions, and then maybe to think about the question, do we need one movement? Yeah, okay, it will happen. This is not a critical factor in the ability of the two movements to pave their way into the Israeli society. And I need to say that today, I think this question is not less relevant to North America and to Europe than to Israel. And the question of how many liberal seminaries to train rabbis we need is more critical today in North America than it is in Israel with the HUC, Schechter and Hartman. So again, if it happens, it happens. If not, the two movements know how to work together in a very good manner in many, many joint arenas, and will continue together to promote first religious pluralism in Israel and freedom of religion, but also, and not less important, the actual and real accessibility of millions of non-Orthodox Israelis to our synagogues and our institutions all across the country.
Thank you, Rabbi Kariv. Rabbi Rowen-Baker.
Just two quick things. One is that I feel that I would not like to see the Reform and Conservative movement merge, because as a devout pluralist who grew up in a home where my father was Orthodox and my mother was Reform, and I turned out conservative, as you know. I really feel that it's important that we all continue to kind of chug in our direction, and it's true that the differences aren't vast, but there are differences, and we challenge each other, and we stimulate each other, and we influence each other, and that's important. And we need that diversity to keep us on our toes, to keep us moving. But I would say that as Dalia often says to me, I'm going to quote you, that we can do a lot of work combining some of our resources, like overlapping some of our rabbinical training programs, and overlapping certainly many of the legal fight, that not just working together, but really creating merging resources, and and creating joint institutions. There's a lot more to say about that, and how exactly to do that. But I think that there's room to merge resources in certain aspects, which are very, very close. Last thing I just want to say is that I think there are many interesting questions here about the Siddur, which I also want to hear an answer to.
Thank you. And Dalia, for a liturgical message.
Okay, so first of all, someone wrote in the chat about the fact that you also have prayer for the soldiers out in other places. I'm posting here on the chat an essay, a link to an essay I wrote about the prayer for the state of Israel, and the differences of the text of this prayer as it is recited in Israel, and as it is recited in progressive congregations outside Israel. I think it's a very interesting thing. One point I want to say before I want to conclude my part with a prayer that I think is suitable for this moment. I'm very much, I like to be invited to talk about the Reform movement, but I'm much more happy to be invited to talk about things as a rabbi, right? When they asked me on the rabbi how to call you, can we call you the Reform rabbi? I said, no, call me a rabbi. If you call the Orthodox guy, Orthodox rabbi, call me a Reform rabbi. But if not, I'm talking with, this is my authority is to be a rabbi. So when I was invited to talk in the youth movement municipality council next week, I find it a great joy. I'm not going to talk. They didn't invite me as a Reform rabbi. They invited me as a rabbi to talk about whatever, Hanukkah, whatever it is. Of course, I'm going to talk about things as a Reform rabbi, but I'm much more happy to be a speaker, and for people, in our circles, to be speakers in the larger circles of the Israeli society when it comes to Jewish matters and ethical matters and moral issues. Before we conclude, I want to share with you a text that was composed exactly for this kind of meetings. So you can see on page 426, toward the end of the Siddur, we have a special prayer for Giyur, for conversion, male version, female version. And just at the bottom of that page, we wanted to include a special prayer for meetings and gatherings of Israeli Jews and Jews from outside the state of Israel. And then we found this beautiful text from the second book of Maccabees. This is how the book begins. And we decided to put it here, and I want to read it to you, and at least part of it, and translate it and to dedicate it to you and to us and to our possibility to meet and to talk and to learn together. And may we do that in abundance in the future to come, face to face, but also here through Zoom. So, אחינו ואחיותינו בתפוצות, שלום וישע רב. Our brothers and sisters in the diaspora, peace on you and great salvation. אדוני אלוהים יברך אתכם ויזכור לכם את בריתו, את אברהם ושרה, את יצחק ורבקה ואת יעקב רחל ולאה. May the Lord, may the eternal, our God bless you and remember for you God's covenant with Abraham and Sarah, with Isaac and Rebecca. Of course, we revised the text a little bit to include the mothers. וייתן לכם לב שלם, and give you and provide you with a complete heart. And we'll move to the last sentence. ישמע אלוהים את תפילתכם וירחם עליכם. May the eternal hear your prayers and have mercy and compassion over you. And in this time we need it so much. ומכל צרה יפלט נפשכם. And from all kind of plight and trouble, he shall save your souls. זאת תפילתנו בעדכם כל הימים. This is our prayer for you all days. ונאמר אמן. תודה רבה.
Thank you so much, Dalia. So just before we formally close off, we really owe more to the topic than we've been able to dedicate at this hour and 14 minutes. So we should revisit it and do more justice to the liturgy and be able to do more justice to the issues.
Okay.
I think that you all have, hello, Diane.
Hi. I just wanted to know, we have a lovely Judaic library in our home, and I like to keep all the movements, you know, it could be the Orthodox, conservative, like myself, Reform. That looks like such a beautiful Siddur, the new Reform one. I'm wondering if there would ever be an English translation, because I think it is a nicer one than what I've ever seen in any Reform temple in America that I have, been in.
I can answer it really quickly. We're working now on an English version of the Siddur, especially the Shabbat part, and it's going to be English Hebrew. So we're working on it right now. Rabbi Levi Kelman and Rabbi Efrat Rotem are working on it. But we also hope that the Siddur will be a resource for other communities around the world. Yeah, this is also our hope.
I know.
I will Diane, that you know about it as soon as it happens.
Yeah. I've also wanted to say for quite a number of years, I sat on the board of the Schechter Institute. And when I would be gifted, lovely books to say, oh, this is for your grandchild. And I'm going, but they're not that fluent. Even when they were going to a Jewish day school, it would have been nicer if there were, some English translations, on these books. That's just me. What can I say?
Thank you.
Oh, this is
what happened to the beard?
Later.
Later. Okay.
Thank you, Diane. So I think that you all had a sense that we need to discuss these issues more, and there were delicate issues that deserve, I think, a bolder attempt to decipher them. And the good news is we were, I think, privileged to three representatives that gave us a sense of the business of growing religious pluralism in Israel is in good hands. And of course, you could see in the chat, Jane Sasswine, one of the foremost leaders of Reconstructionist Judaism, reminded us, as she always does, of Reconstructionist Judaism. And maybe we should have another session in which we'll include maybe Professor Mel Skalt, who is the leading scholar on Mordechai Kaplan, and someone who is made Aliyah and does the outreach for Reconstructionist Judaism in Israel. The reason that it does not appear in the statistics and does not appear in the review of pluralism, such as in Rising Streams, is that it's just at this point too small And whereas the Reform and conservative movements have decided on building an indigenous movement in Israel, I am not sure that that is the policy, at least it didn't used to be the policy in recent years of the Reconstructionist movement. So Jane, no offense meant, we would love to see Reconstructionist Judaism grow in Israel, and it certainly deserves a discussion. We were asked about expats, etc. Lots of issues to discuss further in a future, at a future time. Thank you all, and I look forward to seeing all of you, many of you, in 2 weeks discussing Jewish law in the state of Israel. Shalom and leitraot.
Yeah, Tov.
Be well, everyone.